Hello. So this is part B or part 2 of the 10B lecture. I'm not going to show any video clips. I'm just going to zip through this stuff. Um, anyways, here we go. So review of day 1. When we're looking at dictatorships, liberalism neglects these 3 factors that we looked at last time. It neglects order, too much freedom, belonging. You don't belong to anything. People that believe in dictatorship believe that you should be part of a group. And, ironically, freedom. When you are financially tied to responsibilities, it limits your freedom. Like, for example, if you're in debt, you don't have the freedom to do things, to travel, etc. If you're in more of a collective society, more of a dictatorship, some of those decisions would be made for you, and you would go into areas in which you wanted to instead of going into areas where you would just make money. Okay, the justification for dictatorships. The state was more important than the individual. We need order in society. People are not equal, and so why give everyone an equal say? Okay, and ultimately we need order instead of freedom. So we look at different types of dictatorships. The elites are more important than the other people. Everyone should play their role, do your job, so to speak. Okay, some people are born to lead, some people are born to follow, some people are workers, some people are more intellectual, etc. The major philosophers, thinkers behind dictatorship so far, we looked at Friedrich Nietzsche, his idea of the overman or the Übermensch. Make sure you look at that. Very anti-democratic, obviously anti-religion. And then the other individual was Niccolo Machiavelli, the whole idea that it's better to be feared than loved, and whatever means you need in order to secure power and keep power, you are right to do it. So morality, ethics, etc., out the window as far as Machiavelli. All right, so let's move on to the rest of this lecture. The definition of a dictatorship. And once again, there's different terminologies about this type of political system. You have dictatorships, you have autocracies, you have authoritarian, you have totalitarian, you have autocracy. I probably said that twice. But anyways, once again, absolute monarchy is more of a traditional form of an autocracy. Within a dictatorship, people are told what to do and are expected to obey. Degrees of dictatorship range from what is called a benevolent, that's a kind dictator, to a megalomaniac or totalitarian, whereas all facets of society are controlled by the state. Dissension is not allowed. Okay, you are dealt with, and we'll talk about some of those methods here in a few minutes. So, what is a dictatorship? Political power and authority are concentrated in the hands of one leader or a small group of people. Some would call that an oligarchy, and exercised in a dictatorial manner. Power over society is exercised by the few, the so-called elite. People are encouraged to identify with the leader or one group rather than ideals or principles of a type of government. These regimes respond to perceived destabilizing changes to society. This can be in the form of a radical dictatorship, which is a move towards the far left. People that believe in radical dictatorships would believe in immediate change, would ultimately believe in equality, rejection of tradition, okay, public ownership of the means of production. So when I think of radical dictatorship, I think of Lenin in Russia, 1917. If you even go further back into time, you would look at the Jacobins. Robespierre in the French Revolution wanted immediate change, wanted to destroy traditions and establish something completely different. Okay, here's some more contemporary examples, China. Well, China, originally under Mao certainly was a radical dictatorship, but some would argue that his dictatorship or the dictatorship of China today is not left wing anymore. Um, it has actually certain, uh, you know, right wing dictatorship type principles. So the other type of totalitarian regime is a reactionary, where they're going to hold on to something from the past and use that as their so-called interpretation of history. Okay, revert to the way society was. So they'll say, things have gotten out of hand. We need to go back in time to the way things used to be, not the way that they are now. And so we need to kind of hold fast to those very traditional Burkean kind of principles. Very ultra nationalistic in nature. Okay, so when we look at an ultra or a right wing dictatorship, you think of Nazi Germany. You might think of the military dictatorships, juntas, so to speak, JUNTA, fascist Italy under Mussolini. Okay, but like I had talked about, is that the difference between a radical dictatorship and a reactionary dictatorship, at least in my opinion, isn't that different. Okay, once again, this is just a very similar slide to the one that we looked at. The difference between a radical dictatorship. Of course, I have the picture of Che Guevara, the Cuban revolutionary. Well, actually, he's Argentinian, but he's most famous for being involved in the Cuban Revolution. And then on the other side, you have the reactionary dictator that uses the past as a foundation for their legitimacy. Have a look at this couple of these spectrums here. I've shown you this power spectrum. You'll notice that the fascists and the communists are at the same point of this. They call it a true political spectrum, where you have autocracies, dictatorships that are completely 100% controlled by government, whereas on the other side you have anarchy, where there's complete freedom. Okay, this other one down here, you have, I mean, and like it's some of the captions here, whatever, but you can see fascism and communism are somewhat similar, or at least close on that spectrum. Same thing with this one here, where communism and fascism are close to each other as far as how they control people politically. Some of their backstories might be a little different as far as the definition of equality or something like that. But ultimately, if you look at the methods that Hitler and the Nazis used versus what Stalin used, or even Lenin, they're very similar. This is another one. I think this one's found in page 168 in your textbook. You can see that both Nazi Germany and the USSR fit, fairly to the left, or at least, as far as towards complete political control. And then, even economically, you can see that they're both left wing. USSR completely left wing, but Nazi Germany, in many ways, was a left wing economic society. Yes, they practiced private enterprise, but it was a corporatist state, government controlled, directed private enterprise. Okay, not unlike what you see with crony capitalism, okay, or welfare capitalism. No, sorry, crony capitalism, or where government directed deals with favored corporations. All right, just a couple other slides until we get to the meat and potatoes of this lecture. Um, you have democracy. In theory, people are watching the government to make sure that the government is doing a good job. And then conversely, you have a dictatorship in which the government, with its all-knowing big eye, big brother, so to speak, as referred to 1984, is watching the people. Once again, another diagram just to kind of make it simple. Government makes decisions, and those decisions are carried out by the citizens, whereas in a democracy, the citizens ultimately make the decisions that the government has to eventually carry out, or at least in theory. All right, so the methods and characteristics of a dictatorship. How does a dictator secure power and then keep power? So you harken back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli would argue whatever is necessary. So we'll go through all of these in much more detail, but the first one would be the use of force and violence. Okay, directing popular discontent or scapegoating. Tokenism. Okay, the control of media, controlled participation, limits on dissent. Dissent would be people speaking out, lack of accountability, um, provision for changes to the system. You know, how do leaders change from one leader to another leader? Is there some sort of provision? Is there some sort of thing within the Constitution that says, okay, this is what happens? Indoctrination, propaganda. All right, so let's go through these in a little bit more detail. I'm going to lean back in my chair today. I'm going to drink some of my black coffee in order to keep me going. And here we go. By the way, I've been noticing that not many of you are watching these videos, but you know what? I enjoy doing them. It makes me feel like I'm still trying to stay in touch with all of you. And, in the coming semesters, when a kid is absent from class, perhaps they can watch these from time to time to get caught up. So it's not all wasted. All right, here we go. Number one, use of force and violence. Okay. For example, if you want to keep people under control, you have a strong secret police, you have a strong infrastructure that uh, finds dissenters. Okay, so in the Soviet Union, you had the NKVD, you had the Cheka, you had eventually the KGB. Okay, in Nazi Germany, you had the Gestapo, you had the SS. Of course, the military can come in and kind of root things out and make sure that there's no dissension. You can see here secret police use various methods to seek out and arrest suspected dissenters and enemies of the government. Okay. Fear of violence is often used to maintain power, and the threat of violence can be perceived and can also be very real. Okay. You don't have to kill everyone. You just have to kill just a good number of people, and everyone else just usually falls in line. All right. Couple pictures here. The Soviet Union, one of the ways in which they were able to industrialize fairly quickly during the time of Stalin is they just sent millions of people to gulags, to work camps. Didn't have to pay them, you just had to feed them at least enough to before they, died, but then they just brought new people in. Okay, they never didn't have a supply of labor. Okay, so yeah, gulags, forced labor prisons. Okay, it was basically a slave state. I mean, we talk about slavery, but the Soviet Union practiced slavery for decades during the time of Stalin and some of the other Soviet leaders. All right. Second method that dictators will use to keep power and secure power is scapegoating. The more formal terminology is called directing public discontent. And we all do this, not just governments, but people. Okay. We blame others for our problems. I know I've done it throughout my life. I blame this and I blame that. My kids, they're almost becoming experts on it. They're becoming, they've got their bachelor degree in scapegoating. I think my oldest is now working on her master's degree in scapegoating. Okay, and by the time she leaves home, I'm sure she'll have a PhD in scapegoating. But in a larger picture, societies, governments will blame others. They'll usually find an identifiable group that really can't fight back in order to justify the misfortunes of their country. The Nazis did it with the Jews back in the 1930s. They said the economic woes, the political woes that were occurring in Germany during the Great Depression were, at least in a large part, because of the missteps that a lot of Jews had done during that time period. The Soviet Union, they had scapegoats. During Stalin's collectivization, you learn about the wealthy peasant farmers or the wealthier peasant farmers called the kulaks that were the source of a scapegoat. Once again, people find scapegoats to deflect blame from them towards other groups. All right, another one is something called tokenism. Okay. Oh, there we go. So the whole idea of tokenism, you're given a little bit of power, you're given a little bit of rights. It kind of makes you feel good. Um, and then sometimes they come up with these symbols of the republic, symbols of the dictatorship. The Soviet Union had Stakhanov. Um, you put young people into indoctrinated kind of groups like the Hitler Youth, etc. So you're given some prizes, you're given some rewards, but you're not really given any real power. All right, obviously in a dictatorship, the media is control. Okay, the media, instead of being a watchdog for the government, essentially becomes a vanguard for the government. It's kind of a mouthpiece of the government. They practice censorship. Obviously, will use propaganda in order to promote the government. Controlled participation. Okay. Once again, people are given work within the regime, but uh, it's not any real power. Okay. You take part in elections, but the elections are either rigged or the choices are limited. Um, you know, Once again, uh, you just don't have a lot of power. You think you have some power, but you just don't. I mean, sometimes I liken controlled participation to being part of student council. You have a say, you have meetings, but ultimately the teacher and the principal have control over, uh, the budget and what is done. All right, here's an example of controlled participation in Nazi Germany. Look at that ballot, people. So voting for Hitler was in the center of the ballot. The dot was much bigger. And good luck putting nine or no on that. And more than likely, it wasn't a secret ballot. So people would know if you voted no. And you might just kind of get re educated or disappear if you voted no. This one's not a real ballot. It's a hyperbole of what would happen if you voted against a dictator when they were in control of a country. Please torture me and kill my family. If you have no hands, please smudge the box with your bloody stumps. Silly. All right, dissent or speaking out against the government is completely limited. Okay, you are monitored. Okay, access to media is censored. Um, More than likely, any kind of correspondence with the outside world is limited. Okay, your mail is probably opened up. If you lived in a technological society, they would monitor your internet activity. They would monitor your cell phone activity. They would monitor, you know, basically anything you did in order to kind of get ahead of any kind of dissent within a country. And also, it gets to the point where if they had all this information on you, they could use that against you to go after you or to control you in a future time period. So you might say that it's all right that the government is checking out what I'm doing on TikTok, for example, or on Instagram, but maybe down the road, 5 to 10 years later, um, and you might want to get involved in public life, or maybe you're saying something against the government. Maybe some bureaucrat comes to your door and say, "Okay, this is what you did when you were 17, blah blah blah." You wouldn't want to get that out. Anyways, governments that are dictatorships lack accountability, meaning that no one's controlling them. In a democracy, there's provision to remove a leader, but in a dictatorship, there is no provision to remove a leader. Okay, they don't have to listen to the people. Okay, and because of that, dictatorships over time become rife with corruption. I was watching this TV series called The Americans, and I'm not going to get into too much of it. It's about Soviet spies living in the United States, but one of the things they chronicle is how the Soviet Union was completely full of corruption throughout its whole bureaucracy near the end of its run in the late 80s into the early 90s. So when a leader dies or steps down, there was just no provision for a change to the system. Okay. In the United States, if the president dies, the vice president takes over, and there's a whole line of succession. In a monarchy, there's a line of succession. In Canada, there's a certain way that things are done according to the Constitution. But in a dictatorship, when a leader dies or if there's a power struggle, there isn't something that says the next person here takes over. There's usually a power struggle that takes place over the course of the next number of years. In the Soviet Union, after Lenin's death in 1924, um, that power struggle occurred over a couple of years before Stalin was able to consolidate that. Um, After Stalin's death, once again, there was a power struggle. So there isn't really a provision for a change. Indoctrination, a very important method. Okay, schooling, media, um, education in general, after school groups were all, uh, the whole curriculum, the whole educational piece was designed to convince, to brainwash people of a certain way of thinking. The movie Jojo Rabbit that just came out last year, uh, kind of depicts the indoctrination of the young people in Germany in the 1940s. I would recommend you watch. It's a pretty good movie. And more than likely, when we get to chapter 5, one of the assignments that I'll have you do is one of the options, at least, is a movie review. I'm going to put on a bunch of movies with either a chapter 5 theme or a Cold War theme that's found in chapter 7, and you'll have to watch that movie and you'll have to do kind of a review, synopsis type of thing. And so, I don't know, just something different that's not worksheety kind of thing. All right, so Nazi Germany, of course, had the Hitler Youth. The Soviet Union had their, uh, I think they're called the Young Pioneers. Very, scout-like type activities. Of course, scouts with an ulterior motive, so to speak. Um, this is just an example of the indoctrination found in a Nazi science book. I mean, there's tons of other exemplars that you can look up. All right, propaganda, somewhat like indoctrination, okay? Systematic form of persistent persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions. So it just gets you all jacked up, attitudes, opinions, actions of a specified target. Um, Anyways, for promoting the regime. Okay, it's usually one-sided. Okay, it's not looking at the a multifaceted look. It's usually trying to prop up the regime at the expense of maybe scapegoating another group. Okay, how is propaganda done? In a lot of different ways. When I think of propaganda, I think of Leni Riefenstahl, who created this 1934 documentary called Triumph of the Will, this very propagandic piece that promoted Hitler and the Nazis. So, like I said, selective use of information. It appeals to your emotion, your national pride. It uses symbols, parades, rallies, posters, movies can all be forms of propaganda. You see propaganda even in our world. I mean, when you're trying to prop up your school team or you're trying to promote your country, in a lot of ways, that is propaganda. These are just a couple exemplars of one's the communist propaganda, the other one is Nazi Germany propaganda. Both idealized visions of the leaders at the time. Um, Anyways, This is probably the Williams Social video that outlines dictators. Feel free to watch that at any point. So once again, reviewing these methods, I'm not going to go through them again, but kind of end off this discussion today. How does one become a dictator? Yeah, you don't just like grow up one day and say, I'm going to run a country. Well, some would argue that there's something called a crisis theory, that dictators do not come to power unless there's some sort of economic or a political some crisis that happens in a country that forces the country to become secure at the expense of any kind of freedom. So, right now with a pandemic, some would argue that this would create a crisis which would allow um, people to curtail freedoms. Okay, you're willing to accept this type of power for the sake of security. Okay, the so-called crisis theory. There's also a great man theory. Someone like Nietzsche would probably believe this. Thomas Carlyle, like I said, would believe the great man theory that, troubled times allow for the so-called cream to rise to the top. Okay. Once again, great leaders possess characteristics or traits not found in the rest of the population. If you support a democracy, then everyone has the same amount of power. Okay. Whereas in a dictatorship, you allow the great people to through different organic methods prove themselves and actually win out over time over the weaker type people. Obviously, dictators have a certain amount of charisma. You might think Hitler was buffoon, but in front of a crowd, he could motivate people. He could get them going. Okay, he was, and when times were bad, people were listening to him. I look at some of these examples, Elvis Presley. Oh, let's go back here. Certainly had charisma, at least until he got old and corpulent. But in his early days, he had lots of charisma. The Rock had lots of charisma. Keanu Reeves has a quiet amount of charisma. Okay, but usually a dictator needs to be able to allow or want, or people will want to follow them. All right. A lot of times, a dictator will take over in what is known as a military coup, a coup d'etat, a forced military takeover. Essentially, the military just gets fed up with the government, says that we can do a better job running this country than these uh, white collared buffoons. And so we are going to essentially go to war against the people of the country to just bring it back into order. All right. Different types of dictatorships. If you see these terminologies, they all essentially mean a fairly similar thing. The more traditional form of an authoritarian government is an absolute monarchy, one person autocratic. But, obviously, one person, and unless they had super duper Superman powers, kung fu, all that kind of stuff, aren't going to be able to run the country on their own. They're going to need a cadre of individuals, the oligarchy, to support them. Okay. You got military dictatorships, minority tyrannies, one party states. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these different types. Okay. We should know what an absolute monarchy is, derived through tradition, divine right of kings, etc. The example I have here is Louis XIV. I am the state. One person, one party, autocracy. That's the Communist Party of China is an example of an autocracy. Now, mind you, once again, that's an oligarchy. Okay. The party and the state are the same, they're one. Oligarchy, an elite group. Essentially, all dictatorships are a form of an oligarchy because, once again, the dictator cannot by him or herself run the country. They need the support of basic bureaucracy in order to keep them going. Hitler had the people behind him. Stalin had the people behind him, but it wasn't a huge group. Okay, and then everyone else just kind of fell in line. Okay, once again, when the military takes over, um, uh, Hispanic type of military dictatorship would be called the junta. Okay, it's these people have taken force by a coup d'etat. Okay, decisions and the country is run like a military. Okay, when a minority group runs a country, that is called a minority tyranny. Whereas if the majority group, ethnic, political group runs a country, that's called a majority tyranny. Tyranny just means controlling other people, usually in a harsh way. So during apartheid in South Africa from the 1940s until the early 1990s, that was a minority group within South Africa running the country. Okay, once again, most dictatorships are a one-party state. The Nazi Party was the only party allowed in Nazi Germany. The Communist Party is the only party allowed in the Soviet Union and China. In Iraq with Saddam Hussein, it was called the Ba'ath Party, Baath Party. Okay. Anyways, so one-party states that are still around. You can see a few examples like China still around, Cuba still around, etc. I don't think I'm going to show you this, just the difference between communism and fascism. Okay, they're both dictatorships, they're both authoritarians. There are subtle differences. They're both reject liberalism. Okay, once again, this is just review. Okay. So the commonalities between fascism and communism, they both favor the collective over the individual. They both favor one-party rule. Okay, they both believe in a totalitarian state. Okay, I would say the difference between the two, and I mean, once again, these are similarities: single charismatic leader, top party members, the oligarchy, so to speak, lower party members, and basically everyone else. And so, whether in a fascist regime or a communist regime, it's going to be the same thing. All right, so some of the differences between the two is that fascists draw support from the lower classes in business, whereas communists get their support from the working class. So in theory, business owners would favor fascism because it would allow them to make more money, as long as they did things that the government wanted them to do. In theory, a fascist makes decisions in interest of the state, whereas a communist makes decisions in the interest of the working class. Now, ask someone that lived during Stalin's time, did he make decisions in the interest of the working class, or did he make decisions in the interest of the state? It becomes very muddled at that point. Fascists focus on the activities of the state, whereas communists, at least in theory, want to help the working class around the world. Once again, as we've looked at communism, do you think the Soviet Union went beyond themselves and started helping the working class? Well, I mean, they wanted to promote communism throughout the world, but once again, I would say still fairly similar. Fascists believe in a corporate state, private enterprise that is directed by the government, whereas in a communist society, the state owns all means of production. Okay. Anyways, fascists believe in elitism, an oligarchy, whereas communists believe that the dictatorship of the proletariat was just a stepping stone towards equality. Okay. Anyways, not a ton of differences between the two ideologies. Perhaps fascist has got a more racist background, but Mussolini in Italy, didn't have those same racist underpinnings like Nazi Germany did. All right, I think we're about done, class. So once again, feel free to watch this William Social video on dictatorships. It was available a little bit earlier. Work on the chapter 10B assignment. Like I said, for chapter 5, I'm going to do something different. Maybe it's going to be a movie review. Maybe it'll be a bit of a writing assignment. I just haven't decided yet. Maybe I'll put out a poll or something like that. But like I said, we're going to move from chapter 10B. And then after this, we're going to be in chapter 5. and then we're going to go to chapter 7, okay? And then we're going to move to chapter 12. Okay, chapter 12 is actually a pretty small chapter. Chapter 7 deals with the Cold War, okay? And then that's the end of that unit. We'll probably have one more unit exam that's based on those chapters. And then our last unit, and I know we're running out of time this year, that's fine. Chapter 9, 10A, and 11. And that's going to be basically it. Okay. So anyways, I'll see you when I see you, and I hope to get some of those assignments in pretty soon. And yeah, keep doing what you're doing. Take care, people. Oh, by the way, one last thing. Make sure you have spun for dictator. You'll go to that clip on the website. I mean, you can go from here and do it. Okay, not the video, of course, but the page itself or the link on 10B. You'll click on it. You'll spin, and the person that it stops on is the one you'll choose. And I don't know, and maybe you'll just get to the point where you say, you know what, heck with that. I'm just gonna pick one I want to do. Maybe I want to do Mao Zedong. I'm gonna do Mao Zedong, and you're not gonna know how I spun. And if you want to do that, whatever. Okay, you just go for it. So anyways, at this point of this lesson, I'm going to check out. I'm going to go get some more coffee. I'm going to talk to a couple people because one of the things that it really sucks about being in here is I'm quite alone. And I do miss the interaction that I have with you guys. So hopefully more than 3 people are going to watch this video. You'll get something out of it. I know a couple of you have said that you get something out of it. I hope sometime in the future you'll get more out of it, but whatever. But anyways, I think I'm done. Peace out.